Well, it's kind of funny that it only takes a couple of months to a year for a perspective to change on a pay per view. Because when I left Hell in a Cell 2016, back in 2016, I was actually pretty happy. No, the show wasn't the best in the world. No, the show wasn't the greatest Hell in a Cell pay per view in history. No, the three Hell in a Cell matches were definitely not up there amongst the greatest Hell in a Cell matches in history, but they all delivered in some way, and the main event was historical. And to this day, I still think that. But looking back at it, I also realize what the main event meant, and I also realized just how crappy those first two Hell in a Cell matches were, and just how overrated this show was back then by me and by some others as well. Hell in a Cell 2016, looking back at it, was definitely not the great show that I thought it was. It was pretty bad. Pretty brutal, in fact. With arguably the three worst Hell in a Cell matches in history. And I can't believe I was that positive about it back in 2016. I don't know what was going on in the air. I don't know what was in the air that night. But for whatever reason, I decided to think positively because I'm a little bit too negative, according to some people. Well, sorry, but that negativity's back. Because my perspective on Hell in a Cell 2016 has changed. And not in a good way. Like, let's kick off with Roman Reigns versus Rusev for the US belt in this Hell in a Cell match to kick off the show. I don't know if this feud ever warranted a Hell in a Cell match. I don't know if these two guys were the right guys to put inside Hell in a Cell. Because quite frankly, the cage was of little importance. The cage was not used to the extent that it should have been. It was literally just a wrestling match inside Hell in a Cell, and arguably the worst Hell in a Cell match in history. Now, in terms of the match itself was solid. It was pretty good. Got the crowd pumped up and the crowd into it, even if that meant booing Roman Reigns. But why do we need the Hell in a Cell? Why did we need the Hell in a Cell on that night? I understand it's the Hell in a Cell pay-per-view, but just because it's the Hell in a Cell pay-per-view doesn't mean every match needs to be inside Hell in a Cell. And this feud didn't warrant it. Even though they did that big angle, that big, that match at SummerSlam that never happened. It was just them brawling. You know, that was good. But at the same time, I don't think it was big enough for a Hell in a Cell match. And I'm sorry, but the action in this match was good. It didn't need the cell, which makes it one of the worst Hell in a Cell matches of all time. Sorry, just my opinion. And then it even gets worse. Kevin Owens versus Seth Rollins for the Universal Championship. The one thing that completely boggles my mind and annoys the crap out of me every day is no selling. And in this match, there was so much no selling. So much of it. That once again, the match that you all probably loved is the match that I hate. Just because of the no selling. There was just too much. And I never really liked the chemistry of Owens versus Rollins because they treated their matches like they were on the indies. And in the WWE, that's not a good way to treat and create a match. It's not. It's not a great way to work a match. Because there's going to be a lot of no-selling. There's going to be a lot of spots that don't really tell a true story. It's just going to be them wrestling, making absolutely no sense. That's exactly what this match was. And then we get to the Hell in a Cell match that closed the show. Oh, Owens-Rollins, once again, don't think the feud warranted Hell in a Cell. Although I get it. Because, you know, the whole Chris Jericho factor. But that also brings me to my next point. You know, the Hell in a Cell is there for a reason. So why are we still ending this match with Chris Jericho interference. Why? Does that not bother anybody else? I don't get it. I really don't. Then we get to the Hell in a Cell match that closed the pay-per-view. Charlotte versus Sasha Banks, Raw Women's Championship. By the way, I'm not really talking about the other matches because, quite frankly, I don't remember them. And they were inconsequential and not really that important because, the pay-per-view is called Hell in a Cell, so the Hell in a Cell matches are the ones that are supposed to shine, and they're not, so it's better to talk about them because I get more out of this. Sasha Banks versus Charlotte, Hell in a Cell, Raw Women's Championship. To this day, I still respect the fact that the WWE put the women as the main event of a show. I also respect the fact that they put the women inside Hell in a Cell. I also respect the fact that the Women's Championship was defended in the main event of a pay-per-view inside Hell in a Cell. I respect the fact that the WWE tried to make this match a big deal because the build was pretty decent. The entrances were different, were creative. It felt big. It felt like a big spotlight match. You had that moment like right after the ring introductions where it was just them in the center of the ring as the cage was lowering, and at that moment it felt real, it felt good, it felt big, it felt epic, it felt different. God forbid we can have some different in the WWE. But then, as the cage kept lowering and lowering until it got to the point where it was just about to lower around the ring, and you have Charlotte attack Sasha Banks, and they brawl in the beginning, and once again, it felt real, it felt different. And then you even had a spot where they climbed halfway up the cage. I was praying to God that they didn't go the full distance up the cage because I don't want Charlotte murdering anybody, and I don't want Charlotte killing herself. I'm not that evil. I'm not that evil, but I appreciate the fact that they tried to use their elements wisely. They tried to make this match feel like a Hell in a Cell match. They tried to make this match feel like it deserved to be a Hell in a Cell match. And they had that table spot before the match even started. And they're brawling all around the ring. And you have that big moment where Sasha Banks comes out of the stretcher. I understand that it's ripping off Mick Foley. I get it. But at the same time, you don't really see these kind of moments with the women. You don't. So, after all this, then they get inside Hell in a Cell. The match finally begins. And as the match kept going, I just kept waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting for something big, something epic to happen. And it just didn't. It just didn't. And unfortunately, while this was monumental, while this was a huge match in terms of importance for women's wrestling, for the women's championship, for the whole women's revolution that the WWE did, despite the fact that it was very positive on that end, it doesn't change the fact that this was probably one of the worst Hell in a Cell matches of all time. The spots were weak, they were sloppy, the match was botchy, mainly because Charlotte was there, and Sasha Banks isn't really that much better. They work a very sloppy style. Everything seems kind of coordinated, and as a result, makes it even sloppier. The moves have to happen naturally. Instead, they're just seems like they've set this up before the match. The use of the cell, even though it was there, it was very weak. Like I said, the spots with the weapons, with the tables that they used were weak. I believe that, I could be wrong, but didn't they use a chair or a kendo stick? I could be wrong, but those spots again were weak. And then all of a sudden we get to the finish and it was just abrupt. It was probably one of the worst executed finishes I've ever seen. to one of the worst Hell in a Cell matches I've ever seen. And once again, for some reason, Charlotte goes over on a pay-per-view. While I think that the build-up to this match was good, the one thing that I didn't like was the fact that Sasha Banks once again won a championship on Raw instead of a pay-per-view. And here at Hell in a Cell, for now the second time, Charlotte defeats Sasha, or actually no, the third time, because I forgot that they faced off at SummerSlam. For the third time now, Charlotte defeats Sasha Banks on a pay-per-view for a championship in a big match. For what? For what? Just so that way you can say, well, Sasha Banks held the women's championship 4 times, but who's really going to remember that because she lost them only 2 weeks or 1 week or 3 weeks or 4 weeks later? Who's going to remember that? Nobody. You're going to remember that Charlotte won on pay-per-view. You're not going to remember that Sasha Banks won it on a random episode of Raw. You're not. So even though this match was historical, even though this match was different, even though this match did a lot for the women and the women's revolution, it still doesn't change the fact that the wrong person went over and the match itself was sloppy, botchy, and bad. And that's pretty much it. Hell in a Cell 2016. I was overly positive about it back in 2016 for some reason. But you know what? Perspectives change and people change, and my thoughts on this show have changed, and not for the better.